Well, good evening, folks. I hope you're having fun now. Easter's right around the corner, and we're all gathering just like we did during the hard part of the winter. It's kind of nice here to be around this fire. Just kind of enjoy each other's company and tell some stories. And that's what I plan on doing for you tonight. I got more of that same story. You know, The Untamed by Max Brand. It's a pretty good story, and by golly, we're going to be getting to some exciting stuff for too long, you think? And I think we are. Right now, we're at chapter 24, and it starts with The Rescue. The throng gave back from Dan, as if from the vicinity of a panther. Dan faced the circle of scowling faces, smiling gently upon them. "Look here, Barry," called a voice from the rear of the crowd. "Why do you want to take this Haynes anyway? Throw in your cards with us. We need you." "If it's fighting you want," cried a joker, "maybe Lewis and Patterson will give you all enough of it at the jail." "I ain't never hunting for trouble," said Dan. "Make your play quick," said another. "We got no time to waste, even on Dan Barry. Speak out, Dan. There's a lot of good fellers aiming to take out Haynes and give him what's due him. No more. Are you with us?" "I'm not." "Is that final?" "It is." "All right, tie him up, boys. There ain't no other way." "Look out!" shouted a score of voices, for a gun flashed in Dan's hand. He aimed at no human target. The bullet shattered the glass lamp into 1,000 shivering and tinkling splinters. Thick darkness blotted the room. Instantly thereafter, a blow, a groan, and the fall of a body. Then a confused clamor. "He's here! Give up that gun, damn you! You've got the wrong man. I'm Bill Flynn. Guard the door. Lights, for God's sake. Help!" A slender figure leaped up against the window and was dimly outlined by the starlight outside. There was a crash of falling glass, and as 2 or 3 guns exploded, the figure leaped down outside the house. "Follow him!" "Who was that? Get a light. Who's got a match?" Half the men rushed out of the room to pursue that fleeing figure. The other half remained to see what had happened. It seemed impossible that Whistlin Dan had escaped from their midst. Half a dozen sulfur matches spurted little jets of blue flame and discovered 4 men lying prone on the floor. Most of them with the wind trampled from their bodies, but otherwise unhurt. One of the men was the sheriff. He lay with his shoulders propped against the wall. His mouth was a mass of blood. "Who got you, Rogers? Where's Barry?" The jail, groaned Rogers. "Barry has gone for the jail." Revolvers rattled outside. "He's gone for Haynes," screamed the deputy. "Go get him, boys." "How can he get Haynes? He ain't got the keys." "He has, you fools. When he shot the lights out, he jumped for me and knocked me off the chair. That's when he went through my pockets and got the keys. Get on your way, quick." The lynchers, yelling with rage, were already stamping from the room. With the jangling bunch of keys in one hand and his revolver in the other, Dan started full speed for the jail as soon as he leaped down from the window. By the time he had covered half the intervening distance, the first pursuers burst out of Rogers' house and opened fire after the shadowy fugitive. He whirled and fired 3 shots high in the air. No matter how impetuous, those warning shots would make the mob approach the jail with some caution. On the door of the jail, he beat furiously with his bunch of keys. "What's up? Who's there?" cried a voice within. "Message from Rogers. Hell's started. He sent me with the keys." The door jerked open and a tall man with a rifle slung across one arm blocked the entrance. "What's the message?" he asked. "This," said Dan, and he drove his fist squarely into the other's face. He fell without a cry and floundered on the floor, gasping. Dan picked him up and shoved him through the door, bolting it behind him. A narrow hall opened before him and ran the length of the small building. He glanced into the room on one side. It was the kitchen and eating room in one. He rushed into the one on the other side. 2 men were there. One was Haynes, sitting with his hands manacled. The other was a second guard, who ran for Dan, whipping his rifle to his shoulder. As a flame spurted from the mouth of the gun, Dan dived at the man's knees and brought him to the floor with a crash. He rose quickly and leaned over the fallen man, who lay without moving, his arms spread wide. He had struck his forehead when he dropped. He was stunned for the moment, but not seriously hurt. Dan ran to Haynes, who stood with his hands high above his head. Far away was the shout of the coming crowd. "Shoot and be damned," said Haines sullenly. For answer, Dan jerked down the hands of the lone rider and commenced to try his keys on the handcuffs. There were 4 keys. The 4th key turned the lock. Haines shouted as his hands fell free. "After me," cried Dan, and raced for the stable. As they swung into their saddles outside the shed, the lynchers raced their horses around the jail. "Straightaways," called Dan, "through the cottonwoods and down the lane. After me, Satan." The stallion leaped into a full gallop, heading straight for a tall group of cottonwoods, beyond which was a lane fenced in with barbed wire. Half a dozen of the pursuers were in a position to cut him off, and now rushed for the cottonwoods, yelling to their comrades to join them. A score of lights flashed like giant fireflies as the lynchers opened fire. "They've blocked the way," groaned Haines. 3 men had brought their horses to a sliding stop in front of the cottonwoods, and their revolvers cracked straight in the faces of Dan and Haines. There was no other way to escape. Dan raised his revolver and fired twice, aiming low. 2 of the horses reared and pitched to the ground. The 3rd rider had a rifle at his shoulder. He was holding his fire until he had drawn a careful bead. Now his gun spurted, and Dan bowed far over his saddle as if he'd been struck from behind. Before the rifleman could fire again, Black Bart leaped high in the air. His teeth closed on the shoulder of the lyncher, and the man catapulted from his saddle to the ground. With a yell in his air, Dan and Haines galloped through the cottonwoods and swept down the lane. Chapter 25. The Long Ride. A cheer of triumph came from the lynchers. In 50 yards, the fugitives learned the reason, for they had glimpsed a high set of bars blocking the lane. Dan pulled back beside Haines. "Can the bay make it?" he called. "No, I'm done for." For answer, Dan caught the bridle of Lee's horse close to the bit. They were almost to the bars. A dark shadow slid up and over them. It was Black Bart, with his head turned to look back even as he jumped, as if he was setting an example which he bid them follow. Appallingly high, the bars rose directly in front of him. "Now," called Dan to the tall bay, and jerked up on the bit. Satan rose like a swallow to the leap. The bay followed in gallant imitation. For an instant they hung poised in air. Then Satan pitched to the ground, landing safely and lightly on 4 cat-like feet. A click and a rattle behind them. The bay was also over, but his hind hoofs had knocked down the top bar. He staggered, reeled far to one side, but recovering, swept on after Satan and Dan. A yell of disappointment rang far behind. Glancing back, Haines saw the foremost of his pursuers trying to imitate the feet of the fugitives. But even with the top bar down, he failed. Man and horse pitched to the ground. For almost a mile, the lane held straight on, and beyond stretched the open country. They were in that free sweep of hills before the pursuers remounted beyond the bars. In daytime, a mile would have been a small handicap, but with the night and the hills to cover their flight, and with such mounts as Satan and the tall bay, they were safe. In half an hour, all sound of them had died out, and Haines, following Dan's example, slowed his horse to an easy gallop. The long rider was puzzled by his companion's horsemanship, for Dan rode leaning far to the right of his saddle, with his head bowed. Several times Haines was on the verge of speaking, but he refrained. He commenced to sing in the exultation of freedom. An hour before he had been in the rat trap, with his circle of lynchers around him, and only 2 terror-stricken guards to save him from the most horrible of deaths. Then came fate and tore him away and gave him to the liberty of the boundless hills. Fate in the person of this slender, somber man. He stared at Dan with awe. At the top of a hill, his companion drew rein, reeling in the saddle with the suddenness of the halt. However, in such a horseman, this could not be. It must merely be a freak feature of his riding. "Move," said Dan, his breath coming in pants. "Line out and get to her." "To who?" said Haines, utterly bewildered. "Delilah." "What?" "Damn you, she's waiting for you." In the name of God, Barry, why do you talk like this after you saved me from hell? He stretched out his hand eagerly, but Dan reined Satan back. Keep your hand. I hate you worse than hell. There ain't room enough in this world for us both. If you want to thank me, do it by keeping out of my path, because the next time we meet, you're going to die, Haynes. It's writ in a book. Now feed your hoss the spur and run for Kate Cumberland. But remember, I'm going to get you again if I can. Kate? Began Haynes. She sent you for me? Only the yellow blazing eyes made answer, and the wail of a coyote far away on the shadowy hill. Kate! Cried Haynes again, but now there was a world of new meaning in his voice. He swung his horse and spurred down the slope. At the next hill crest he turned in the saddle, and he saw the motionless rider still outlined against the sky, brought the bay to a halt. He was greatly troubled. For a reason mysterious and far beyond the horizon of his knowledge, Dan was surrendering Kate Cumberland to him. He's doing it while he still loves her, muttered Haynes. And am I the cur enough to take her away from him after he has saved me from God knows what? He turned his horse to ride back, but at that moment he caught the weird, the unearthly note of Dan's whistling. There was both melancholy and gladness in it. The storm wind running on the hills and exulting the blind terror of the night had such a song as this to him. If he was a man, Haynes argued briefly with himself, I'd do it. But he isn't a man, he's a devil. He has no more heart than the wolf which owns him as master. Shall I give a girl like Kate Cumberland like that to a wild panther? She's mine, all mine. Once more he turned his horse and at this galloped steadily on into the night. When Haynes dropped out of sight, Dan's whistling stopped. He looked up to the pitiless glitter of the stars. He looked down to the somber sweep of black hills. The wind was like a voice saying over and over, failure. Everything was lost. He slipped from the saddle and took off his coat. From his left shoulder the blood welled slowly, steadily. He tore a strip from his shirt and attempted to make a bandage, but he could not manage it with one hand. The world thronged with hostile forces eager to hunt him to the death. He needed all his strength, and now that was ebbing from a wound which a child could have staunched for him. But where could he even find such a friendly child? Truly all was lost. The satyr or the Black Panther once had less need of a man's help than had Dan. But now he was hurt in body and soul. That matchless coordination of eye with hand and foot was gone. He saw Kate smiling into the eyes of Haynes. He imagined Bill Kilduff sitting on the back of Satan, controlling all that glorious force and speed. He saw Hal Purvis fighting venomously with Bart for the mastery which eventually must belong to the man. He turned to the wild pair. Vaguely they sensed a danger threatening their master, and their eyes mourned for his hurt. He buried his face on the strong, smooth shoulder of Satan and groaned. There came the answering whinny and the hot breath of the horse against the side of his face. There was the whine of Black Bart behind him, and the rough tongue of the wolf touching his dripping fingers. Then he felt the hot gust of the wolf's breath against his hand. Too late he realized what that meant. He whirled with a cry of command, but the snarl of Black Bart had cut it short. The wolf stood bristling, trembling with the eagerness for the kill, his great white fangs gleaming, his snarl shrill and guttural with the fiercity of his desire. For he had tasted blood. Dan understood as he stared into the yellow-green fury of the wolf's eyes. Yet he felt no fear, only a glory in the fierce, silent conflict. He could not move the fingers of his left hand, but those of his right curved and stiffened. He desired nothing more in the world than the contact with the great, bristling black body, to leap aside from those ominous teeth, to set his fingers in the wolf's throat. Reason might have told him the folly of such a strife, but all that remained in his mind was the love of combat, a blind passion. His eyes glowed like those of the wolf, yellow fire against the green. Black Bart crouched still lower, gathering himself for the spring. But he was held by the man's yellow gleaming eyes. They invited the battle. Fear set its icy hand on the soul of the wolf. The man seemed to tower up thrice his normal height. His voice rang, harsh, sudden, unlike the utterance of a man or beast. Down! Fear conquered Black Bart. The fire died from his eyes. His body sank as if from exhaustion. He crawled on his belly to the feet of his master and whined in unutterable submission. And then that hand, warm and wet, with the thing whose taste set the wolf's heart on fire with the lust to kill, was thrust against his nose. He leaped back with bared teeth, growling horribly. The eyes commanded him back, and commanded him relentlessly. He howled dismally to the senseless stars, yet he came, and once more that hand was thrust against his nose. He licked the fingers. That bloodlust came hotter than before, but his fear was greater. He licked the strange hand again, whining. Then the master kneeled. Another hand, clean and free from that horrible warm, wet sign of death, fell upon the shaggy back. The voice, which he knew of old, came to him, blew away the red mist from his soul, and comforted him. "Poor Bart," said the voice, and the hand went slowly over his head. "It weren't your fault." The stallion whinnied softly. A deep growl formed in the throat of the wolf, a mighty effort at speech. And now, like a gleam of light in a dark room, Dan remembered the house of Buck Daniels. There, at least, they could not refuse him aid. He drew on his coat, though the effort set him sweating with agony, got his foot in the stirrup with difficulty, and dragged himself to the saddle. Satan started at a swift gallop. "Faster, Satan! Faster, partner!" What a response! The strong body settled a little closer to the earth as that stride increased. The rhythm of the pace grew quicker, smoother. There was no adequate phrase to describe the matchless motion. And in front, always just a little in front, with the plunging forefeet of the horse, seeming to threaten him at every stride, ran Black Bart, with his head turned as if he were the guard and guide of the fugitive. Dan called, and Black Bart yelped in answer. Satan tossed up his head and neighed as they raced along. The two replies were like human assurances that there was still a fighting chance. Well, the steady loss of blood was telling rapidly now. He clutched the pommel, set his teeth, and felt oblivion settle slowly and surely upon him. As his senses left him, he noted the black outline of the next high range of hills, a full 10 miles away. He only knew the pace of Satan never slackened. There seemed no effort in it. He was like one of those fabled horses, the offspring of the wind, and like the wind, tireless, eternal of motion. A long oblivion fell upon Dan. As he roused from it, he found himself slipping in the saddle. He struggled desperately to grasp the saddle horn and managed to draw himself up again. But the warning was sufficient to make him hunt about for some means of making himself more secure in the saddle. It was a difficult task to do anything with only one hand, but he managed to tie his left arm to the bucking strap. If the end came, at least he was sure to die in the saddle. Vaguely he was aware, as he looked around the black hills, were no longer in the distance. He was among them. On went Satan. His breath was coming more and more labored. It seemed to Dan's dim consciousness that some of the spring was gone from that glorious stride which swept on and on with the slightest undulation. Like a shallow skimming before the wind, but so long as strength remained, he knew that Satan would never falter in this pace. As the delirium swept once more shadow-like on his brain, he allowed himself to fall forward. He wound his fingers as closely as possible in the thick mane. His left arm jerked horribly against the bonds. Black night swallowed him once more. Only his invincible heart kept Satan going throughout that last stretch. His ears lay flat on his neck, lifting only when the master muttered and raved in his fever. Foam flew back against his throat and his breast. His breath came shorter, harder, with a rasp, but the gibbering voice of the rider urged him on, faster and faster. They toppled a small hill, and little to the left and a mile away rose a group of cottonwoods. And Dan, recovering consciousness, knew the house of Buck. He also knew that his last moment of consciousness has come. Surges of sleepy weakness swept over his brain. He could never guide Satan to the house. "Bart," he called feebly. The wolf, whining, dropped back beside him. Dan pointed his right arm straight ahead. Black Bart leaped high into the air, and his shrill yelp told him that he had seen the cottonwoods in the house. Dan summoned the last of his power and drew the reins over the head of Satan. "Take us in, Bart," he said, and twisting his finger into Satan's mane, fell across the saddle horn. Satan, understanding the throwing of the reins as an order to halt, came to a sharp stop, and the body of the senseless rider sagged to one side. Black Bart caught the reins. They were bitter with salt and blood of the master. He tugged hard. Satan whinnied his doubt, and the growled Black Bart answered, half a threat. In a moment more, they were picking their way through the brush towards the house of Buck Daniels. Satan was far gone with exhaustion. His head drooped, his legs sprawled with every step, his eyes were glazed, yet he staggered on with the great black wolf pulling at the reins. There was the salt taste of blood in the mouth of Black Bart. So he stalked on, saliva dripping from his mouth, and his eyes glazed with lust to kill. His furious snarling was the threat at which urged on the stallion. Chapter 26. Black Bart Turns Nurse. It was old Mrs. Daniels who woke first at the sound of scratching and growling. She roused her husband and her son, and all three went to the door, Buck in the lead with his 6-gun in his hand. At the sight of the wolf, he started back and raised his gun. But Black Bart fawned about his feet. "Don't shoot, it's a dog, and there's his master," cried Sam. "By the Lord, they's a dead man tied on that there hoss." Dan lay on Satan, half fallen from the saddle and his head hanging far down, only sustained by the strength of the rein. The stallion, wholly spent, stood with his legs braced, his head low, and his breath coming in short gasps. The family ran to the rescue. Sam cut the rein, and Buck lowered the limp body in his arms. "Buck, is he dead?" whispered Mrs. Daniels. "I don't feel no heartbeat," said Buck. "Help me fetch him into the house, Dad." "Look out for the hoss," cried Sam. Buck started back and his burden just in time, for Satan, surrendering to his exhaustion, pitched to the ground and lay with sprawling legs like a dog spent rather than a horse. "Let the hoss be," said Buck. "Help me with the man. He's hurt bad." Mrs. Daniels ran ahead and lighted a lamp. They laid the body carefully upon a bed. It made a ghastly sight. The bloodless face with the black hair fallen wildly across the forehead, the mouth loosely open and the lips black with dust. "Dad," cried Buck, "I think I've seen this feller. God knows if he's living or dead." He dropped to his knees and pressed his ear over Dan's heart. "I can't feel no motion. Ma, get me the hand mirror." She had it already and now held it close to the lips of the wounded man. When she drew it away, their three heads drew close together. "They's missed on it. He's livin'," cried Buck. "It ain't nothing," said Sam. "The glass ain't quite clear, that's all." Mrs. Daniels removed the last doubt by running her finger across the surface of the glass. It left an unmistakable mark. They wasted no moment then. They brought hot and cold water, washed out his wound, cleansed away the blood, and while Mrs. Daniel and her husband fixed the bandages, Buck pounded and rubbed the limp body to restore the circulation. In a few minutes, his efforts were rewarded by a great sigh from Dan. He shouted in triumph, and then, "By God, it's Whistlin Dan Barry." "It is," said Sam. "Buck, they's been devils working tonight. It sure took more than one man to nail him this way." They fell to work frantically. There was a perceptible pulse. The breathing was faint but steady, and a touch of color came in the face. "His arm will be all right in a few days," said Mrs. Daniels, "but he may fall into a fever. He's turning his head from side to side and talking. What's he saying, Buck?" "He's saying, 'Faster, Satan.'" "Well, that's the hoss," interpreted Sam. "Hold us straight, Bart." "That's what he's saying now." "Well, that's the wolf." And it's all for Delilah. Who's Delilah, Dad? Maybe it's some feller Dan knows. Some feller, repeated Mrs. Daniels with scorn. It's some worthless girl who's got Whistlin Dan into this trouble. Dan's eyes opened, but there was no understanding in them. Haynes, I hate you worser than hell. It's Lee Haynes who done this, cried Sam. If it is, I'll cut out his heart. It can't be Haynes, broke Mrs. Daniels. Old man Perkins, didn't he tell us that Haynes was the man that Whistlin Dan Barry had brought down to the Elkhead? How could Haynes do this shooting while he is in jail? Ma, said Sam, you watch Whistlin Dan. Buck and me'll take care of the hoss, that black stallion. He pretty near all gone, but he's worth saving. What I don't see is how he found his way to us. It's certain Dan didn't guide him all that way. How does the wind find its way, said Buck. It was the wolf that brought Dan up here, but standing here talking won't tell us how. Let's go out and fix up Satan. It was by no means an easy task. As they approached the horse, he heaved himself up, snorting, and stood with legs braced and pendant head. Even his eyes were glazed with exhaustion, but behind them it was easy to guess the dauntless anger which raged against these intruders. Yet he would have been helpless against them. It was Black Bart who interfered at this point. He stood before them, his hair bristling and his teeth bared. Sam suggested, leave the door of the house open and let him hear Whistlin Dan's voice. It was done. At once, the delirious voice of Dan stole out to them faintly. The wolf turned his head to Satan with a plaintive whine, as if asking why the stallion remained there and when the voice was audible. Then he raced for the open door and disappeared into the house. Hurry in, Buck, called Sam. Maybe the wolf will scare Ma. They ran inside and found Black Bart on the bed straddling the body of Whistlin Dan and growling at poor Mrs. Daniels, who crouched in a corner of the room. It required patient work, for he was convinced that they actually meant no harm to his master. What's the reason of it? Queried Sam helplessly. The damn wolf let us take Dan off the hoss without making any fuss. Sure he did, assented Buck, but he ain't sure of me yet, and every time he comes near me, he sends the cold chills up my back. Having decided that he might safely trust them to touch Dan's body, the great wolf went the round and sniffed them carefully, his hair bristling and the forbidding growl lingering in his throat. In the end, he apparently decided that they might be tolerated, though he must keep an eye upon their actions. So he sat down beside the bed and he followed with an anxious eye every moment of Mrs. Daniels. The men went back to the stallion. He still stood with his legs braced far apart and his head hanging low. Another mile of that long race and he would have dropped dead beneath the rider. Nevertheless, at the coming of the strangers, he reared up his head a little and tried to run away. Buck caught the dangling reins near the bit. Satan attempted to strike out with his forehoof. It was a movement as clumsy and slow as the blow of a child, and Buck easily avoided it. Realizing the helplessness, Satan whinnied a heartbreaking appeal for the help to his unfailing friend Black Bart. The wail of the wolf answered dolefully from the house. Good Lord, groaned Buck, now we'll have the black devil on our hands again. No, we won't, chuckled Sam. That wolf won't leave Dan. Come on along, old hoss. Nevertheless, it required hard labor to urge and drag that stallion to the stable. At the end of that time, they had the saddle off and a manger full of fodder before him. They went back to the house with the impression of having done a day's work. Which it shows the full nature of a hoss, moralized Sam. That stallion would be willing to lay right down and die for the man who's just rode him up to the front door of death. But he wishes everlastingly that he had the strength to kick the daylight out of you and me that's been trying to take care of him. You just write this down inside your brain, Buck. A hoss is like a woman. They just naturally ain't got no reason in 'em. They found Dan in heavy sleep, his breath coming irregularly. Mrs. Daniels stated that it was the fever which she had feared, and she offered to sit up with the sick man through the rest of that night. Buck lifted her up from the chair and took her place beside the bed. No one but me is going to take care of Whistlin Dan, he stated. So the vigil began, with Buck watching Dan, and Black Bart, alert, suspicious, ready for the first wrong move, to leap at the throat of Buck.